Over the years, I've learned it's pretty critical to have a sense of humor about how my mind works. I don't know about you, but it helps me a lot. So years ago, I noticed a rash that would show up on my face. And I couldn't figure out what was causing this, so I had to have different theories. It would kind of go along here, sometimes here. So I thought it must be working outside in the heat, which we do, and maybe it's an allergic reaction to my perspiration, because it would come and it would go, and I had no clue what was bringing this on. But that theory didn't hold, because over time, I would see that this rash would show up at different times of the year when I wasn't working outside in the heat. And so I was confused. So similarly, before meeting the Dharma, I had no clue what brought suffering and happiness, and I chased the people and the things that I was convinced would bring me happiness. And lo and behold, they didn't. But because I hadn't met the Dharma yet, I just kept doing what I was doing before, thinking that if I did it long enough and hard enough, the results for happiness would come. And of course, I didn't know anything about the fact that non-virtue definitely brings unhappiness, and virtue brings happiness. Same thing, I just kept on doing what I was doing. So at one point, about 3 years ago, we had this wonderful harvest of plums here. And people were also offering us plums from their trees. And I ate the plums at every meal because I love plums. And we cook them, we make them into compote. I would put it on granola, in porridge. I would put it in a bowl by itself. It was really wonderful pleasure. And the rash took off. So I decided to see if my hunch about the connection between plums and the rash was accurate. So it happened during this outbreak that I was going for my annual physical exam. And I mentioned this to my doctor that I really like. And she seemed curious about my theory. And she said, well, actually what you've got is perioral dermatitis. So I'm going to give you this tube. I hate taking medicine. She said, put this on. This will take care of it. Perioral dermatitis. She wasn't so sure about the rash thing. So I tried the cream. But more importantly, I temporarily stopped eating the plums. And so the rash went away. But I wasn't sure that that was the solution of stopping the plums. So now I have the antidote, right, that I don't even like. So I wasn't really ready to stop eating the plums, even though there was mounting evidence that they were the source of the rash. Similarly, when I started to hear the teachings on karma, intellectually, of course, they make sense. My ways of thinking, though, and reacting show that I don't have these teachings integrated in my mind and heart. And if I got irritated, it's reasonable and just. Besides, it's just irritation. What's the big deal? It's just irritation. So at a very deep level, I was not convinced on even the 4 general characteristics of karma. Because it's just irritation. Give me a break. And so because of my love and attachment for plums, I kept eating them. The rash would show up. I'd apply the cream, and it seemed worth it for a while to have a rash that I could control by applying the cream in order to satiate my incessant craving for this taste pleasure of plums. In short, I chose not to control my desire for plums. And I'd apply the antidote. I mean, what's the big deal? They're plums. They're on any food guide. It's a healthy food. Come on, what's the big deal? And they're grown on the Abbey property. We don't use pesticides. The people who give us plums, they don't use pesticides. So I took every angle I could take to justify my continuing consumption of something that was causing me suffering. So at one point, and then, we keep, and as we're seeing in the teachings this week with Geshe-la, the opponents keep making these points on the same thing from different angles, and they keep getting refuted. So at one point, this is one I love, I went to our acupuncturist and I said, do you think there's a connection between eating plums and this rash? And he said, well, I think it's a likely source of your problems, but have you considered eating cooked plums? That might not do it. So it was like, yes. And so I put cooked plums on everything, on granola, on porridge, in a bowl by itself, on toast, on those rice crackers that taste like cardboard. It went everywhere. And then, whammo, last year, it came on like it's never come on before. Here and here. And it was really painful this time. It was so painful, I couldn't even use the antidote because it hurt too much. So here we are in the middle of a pandemic last fall, and I phoned my dermatologist, and she can't see me. And I told her my sad story, and she said, well, you can see my colleague. So I went in with the mask and the whole thing, and I go to her clinic. And so this other dermatologist, who's a lovely woman, really wise too, she heard my story. I told her the whole story about this years of connection with Plums. And we're both in masks, of course, and so is her assistant. And so she says, well, let me take a look. Just pull off your mask just for a few seconds. So I pull it off, and I can see her go like this. And she's trying to contain herself, right? She's a dermatologist. And her assistant sort of went like this. And she said, you can put your mask back on. She said, you have a classic case of perioral dermatitis. Did you use the cream? And I said, no, it hurt too much. And she said, well, of course it's going to hurt. You have to use the antidote, whether you like it or not. And then she said, well, look, we can get rid of this. We can get rid of this. I'm going to give you these pills. But you have to take them as prescribed, and then you have to taper off, because if you taper off too soon, whammo, it'll come right back and it'll last even longer. There's a chance you'll have this for life. So at that point, I knew I had to quit Plums. I don't like taking pills. And the dermatologist was right. It took quite some time. I did taper off a little bit too soon. It came back, so I went back on and tapered it off more slowly. So similarly, when we listen to the teachings and apply the teachings, the Buddha is clearly telling us, look, you have a classic textbook case of being under the power of afflictions and polluted karma. And you can get rid of this self-grasping, but you're going to have to take the medicine. It's going to take quite some time, and you're going to also have to engage in purification practices and creating merit, and you better not back off of that too soon, because you'll be back at square one. So my self-centered thought may have felt some kind of special achievement at having conquered the drive to eat plums. I don't eat them anymore. I don't. As if this is some kind of practice of austerity, or even greater, mistakenly thinking that I've achieved some kind of detachment. But as we heard this week in Gyaltsabje's commentary on Dharmakirti's Pramanavartika, quote, to become thoroughly detached from an object or type of object, it is not sufficient that we see that what was once a source of pleasure is now a source of suffering. And as Dharmakirti notes, the fact that a person, and I changed it to person from he, my male friends in the room, the fact that a person may come to see the flaws in someone to whom they have been attached does not mean that they see all men or women as flawed. Indeed, most people who have rejected one man or woman will attach themselves to another. Even if a person should come to see attachment to men and women in general as flawed because of their unhappy experiences with one, they will still seek pleasure for his or her phantom self through attachment to other objects or activities like drinking, travel, plums, or art. And as long as they persist in their innate attachment to the self, they will continue to seek some kind of pleasure for that self, and thus grasp at one or another object that pertains to the self. Thus grasping, he or she will continue to be reborn in samsara. Similarly, knowing that I cannot eat plums anymore, I know I can still keep eating peaches with that same level of attachment, even more that I had for plums. So it is so easy to find a replacement for our object of attachment. So easy. I've abstained from eating plums now for an entire year. And I have never had a return of the perioral dermatitis. The suffering from seeing plums in plum compote, plum crumble, plums anywhere, has slowly receded, But simply abstaining from eating plums has not addressed the root of the problem. The attachment for sense pleasure of eating plums is still there. And deeper than that, of course, is the grasping at a self that wants contact with things that, of course, bring pleasure to my senses. And if I were to foolishly say that refraining from eating plums is the austerity that will destroy all my polluted karma and afflictions, and if I made that declaration to Venerable Thupten Chodron, she would very kindly point out, or maybe not, that I have a classic textbook case of deep confusion brought about by wrong views, and that I better start reviewing all these precious teachings that we received this week from Geshe Tabke. So I'll conclude with a quote from Roger Jackson's book. As long as one does not abandon self-grasping, one will continue to seize on whatever good one can find in what pertains to the self, assuming that good will attribute to the happiness of the self. In fact, however, one's attitude is based on a distorted understanding of reality and entails a grasping that only serves to lengthen one's term in samsara. Plums are not worth it.